What is going on, guys? It is Jong here, and today I want to go over my $1.6 million property portfolio, how I've saved for it, the strategies that I've used to generate that wealth, and why I've chosen property as an asset class. I also wanted to give you a little bit of a portfolio update considering we just purchased our third property, and I also wanted to let you know that you guys can actually build wealth the same way too. You know, it's only been 4 years since we bought our first property, and my wife and I don't earn anything more than the Australian average income combined together. So if you're in that same position, you can generate wealth through the same process. Starting out, money management is the most important thing. Learning how to control your spending and the outgoings that are coming out every single month or week or day, or however long of a duration that you're willing to manage your money for, is the most important thing you can do. I think back to growing up with my dad as well. My dad and I actually lived together for about 2 or 3 years, and essentially I would have to pay rent. We would share the rent together. So although I was only working on the weekend, I'd have to work pretty hard to save up that rent amount so that we could live in the same house together. And essentially that really drove in the fundamentals of what the cost of living was, how much it was to live on a day-to-day or monthly expenses, and how to really manage your money so that you can afford those types of living expenses. And I guess that all fed into my really good money habits growing up. Essentially, you know, being put on the back foot and having to fend for myself, and understanding the value of money and having to earn money in a separate way. And I think, you know, if you can put yourself in that position of you've got your own experiences, you should really take advantage of that. Although it might not be ideal at the situation, you might not be earning as much and having, you know, everything pretty much is outgoing, at least you understand those fundamentals of, you know, what it costs to go out and buy dinner at a restaurant, or what it costs to go and rent and live in a place. And it wasn't until a little bit later that I realized that these money habits were going to help me develop and build my savings for that first initial deposit. And I think, you know, being able to understand that you have to trap that surplus excess, you know, the less that you spend, the more that you can save, the bigger deposit you're gonna have. And although I had saved pretty hard already, I knew that I wasn't earning enough. And so I think that's the next step. Once you've got those money management fundamentals down packed, I think the next best thing you can do is understand how you can earn more income. What else I didn't realize at that time is the YouTube algorithm and how much it helps when you smash that like button. So please go ahead and do so now if you would like. Where the property background all started essentially was with my old man. He was a real estate agent, and you know, he had all these property mates. All of his friends all owned ridiculously wealthy properties. And I guess, you know, hanging out with them and having family dinners with them, I really understood how they were able to generate wealth through property. He also had a ton of books on his bookshelf that was super insightful, that were all the old classics like Steve McKnight, Margaret Lomas, and I think I started reading them from a really young age and grabbed those fundamentals by the horn. Leverage has always been a massive driver for me, being able to leverage a small deposit into a large house and then grow that large amount of money compounding over time has always been the real indicator. You can use a 20% deposit of $100,000, buy a $500,000 house with it, and then that $500,000 grows compounding. I think also too, looking back historically, properties always performed consistently better than inflation. So if anything, I'm just hedging my bets against inflation. If you're not sure what inflation is, it's essentially money decreasing in value over time. So there's this thing called the RBA, it's the Reserve Bank of Australia, and essentially it's the bank of the big banks. And the RBA set this thing called the inflation target at about 2 or 3% per year. And what 2 or 3% means really is if you had $100 today, in 1 year's time after a 3% decrease, it's only going to be worth $97 next year. Or for example, let's say over a 10-year period, if you bought $100 worth of goods in 2009, the same amount of goods and services would actually cost you $123 in 2019. I guess another big main driver is the cash on cash return. So if I invest my $100,000 deposit into a $500,000 house, well, that $500,000 house, if it grows by 5% the next year, say, it's gonna grow by $25,000. So I'm earning $25,000 a year from a $100,000 investment. That's a 25% return. Obviously, it's not as straightforward as just a 5% growth and, you know, those straight numbers. There's a ton of other purchasing and holding costs that you have to factor in as well. But ideally, that growth compounds over time. So if it grows by 5% next year, then 5% the year on top of that, and 5% the year on top of that. You know, over a 20, 30, 40 year period, that compound effect just gets massive. Another massive caveat to property is that not all property are created equally. You can't just buy, an off-the-plan apartment and expect it's going to grow the same as a house on a big block of land. It all comes down to this asset selection. So I guess growing up, this property background really drove me to get into a Bachelor of Housing, and I really had no idea what a Bachelor of Housing was. Essentially, it's the same as a Bachelor of Construction Management, just more residential focused. So while I was studying for my degree, I essentially got into the construction game. I was working 3 days a week at a construction company. I was doing 2 days a week at uni, including nights, and I was also working 2 days on the weekend in an aquarium. So as you can imagine, it was a pretty hectic schedule, but that allowed me to save a pretty big deposit. Although, starting at 19 and being pretty young, I didn't buy my first property till I was 23, and there was probably a couple of setbacks that put me back from buying a property earlier. My first biggest setback was buying an XR6 Ford Turbo, and that was $14,000. I already had, a little Civic, and it was costing me a bomb in fuel. I think this purchase was essentially just driven by my friends, like the people I was hanging out with at the time. They really, they already had nice cars or fast cars, so I wanted to get in and have one too. And they were really good dudes, like they were good to hang out with, they were great friends, but our goals just weren't aligned. And I guess lifestyle creep had a massive factor here too. Like as I was earning more, the more I wanted to spend. I wasn't like catching that surplus and saving it. I was like, oh, I'm earning a little bit more, I deserve to buy myself a new car and really splurge here. I think that's definitely been my biggest regret. I would have been just fine, driving around in my 92 Honda Civic. It gets me from A to B and just gets the job done. I could also add in here that another setback would be going on a couple of holidays with my best friends, but I think, they're some of the best life experiences that I'll ever have, and I'll never be able to go back and get them again, so I would never take them back. And I think traveling the world and living life with different people and experiencing life in different ways with your best mates is probably one of the best things that you could do. I do think though my second biggest setback was moving to Melbourne when I was 22. Essentially it was like a completely new playing ground. I had no idea where I was, where the locations were like. I didn't know where the train stations were. I didn't know how to get from A to B. It was like a completely new world. I had to find completely new friends. Luckily my wife, now girlfriend at the time, was living in Melbourne, so I could hang out with her and her family most of the time. But you just have no idea. You're so unsure, you're so uncertain, and I think holding on to that savings and not using it to buy a house was, I was so insecure. So I didn't want to spend that money that was in my savings account. I just wanted to get secure, get firm, and get happy again. Not that I wasn't happy, but I didn't have a job at the time. I resigned when I moved to Melbourne, so I didn't have a job. I had to find a job, and there was just so many insecurities. But eventually I did settle down. I found a job and I was working pretty well, and then I got poached from my old company. They wanted to hire me again, so I was working remotely for them, and essentially everything was back to normal. My wife and I got engaged, and it was now time to buy a property. Because my wife and I were engaged and we're buying a property to live in, we were buying as owner-occupiers, and I think that's probably one of the best things that you can think of when you're buying a property. You don't want to be buying something that we classify as investor stock, which is like these, one-bed apartments in the city where there's hundreds of them, and you one in 100, you're paying all these large strata fees for lifts and pools and all that sort of stuff. One of my biggest things right now is I'm always looking for owner-occupier appeal. You want to buy properties that people actually want to live in, because there's an increased demand for those types of properties consistently over time. So we got married on the 28th of May 2016, and we purchased our property just before then. I think we settled just before we moved in, so it must have been a couple of months. And we bought our first property for $415,000 back in 2016. We only had a $35,000 deposit at that time, and essentially it all got sucked up by purchasing costs. Thankfully, we were first home buyers and we didn't have to pay stamp duty, but we were pretty leveraged. We were only on a 5% deposit. We were borrowing 95% on a 95% LVR. So, we did have to pay lender's mortgage insurance and all of that other stuff and other costs that come with it. I wouldn't really have considered myself an investor back then. We were really just purchasing a property to live in, so the investor mindset wasn't really kicking in. So for the first sort of 2.5 years there, we were just really comfortable. We were living our lives, we traveled a heap, we purchased a new car, we're still being frugal with our money and saving, but we didn't have that investor mindset. Like we didn't want to invest into our future or save really, really hard and buy multiple properties. We were kind of just living in our principal place of residence. It wasn't until about December 2018 where everything really kicked back into gear and I wanted to get into investor mode. I knew that, I didn't want to just retire on the pension or live off my superannuation or, be at the same job for the next 50 years. I really wanted to build my wealth to help myself in the future. So I talked to my mortgage broker at the time, and we analyzed the property that we had purchased beforehand, and it had grown pretty significantly. Started with a low LVR, so we only started with a 5% deposit, and when we refinanced, we could only borrow 80% again, so we're going from 5% to 20% what the banks had. So we could only pull out 100 grand of equity to the top, which was incredible. But yeah, that's essentially a massive increase in 2.5 years, and I was super wrapped with that, and that allowed us to leverage into the next property. We also had about 40k of savings at that time as well, so we had about 140 to spend, including the deposit and purchasing costs. The existing property that we're in was at an 80% LVR, so I was pretty comfortable at that level and didn't feel too overexposed. And I think that's another super important thing, is just to have safety buffers in place for that you can sleep at night. So essentially, for me now, I've always got 6 months worth of expenses on hand. I don't spend any more of it, just so that I know that, like, if we both lost our job or, a pandemic hits like the coronavirus, then, we can be comfortable for 6 months and figure it out until that point. We don't have to sell our properties at a rush to try and, live off the income. We're quite comfortable. So always make sure that you've got a nice safety buffer at hand. So at this point in time, my wife and I actually went pretty hard. We moved out with my brother and sister-in-law, my wife's brother and sister, and essentially that was just so that we could reduce our costs of living. So we were splitting everything by 4 rather than splitting everything by 2. We also turned our old family home into an Airbnb, and this was pretty daunting at the time because we essentially left all of our furniture, all of our worldly goods, everything at the property, so for other people to live in, and it was kind of daunting. Like when we moved out, we're kind of like, oh, we don't have anything. We're living off my brother and sister-in-law's furniture, and it was kind of like, what have we done? Thankfully, that Airbnb venture did go pretty well. I think we had like a 92% occupancy rate for the first 12 months, which is pretty good considering, it's a short-term rental stay. But we also did get some really good longer stays at some really good rates as well. So essentially the Airbnb was paying for itself, all of its running costs, all of the bills, electricity, gas, all that sort of stuff. And it was paying for our living costs as well. So about 3 months after moving out and the Airbnb was pretty stable with its income, we decided to go for our second property. We did use a 20% deposit for this one, so it cost us $96,000 as a deposit, but essentially that was just all of the $100,000 of equity that we pulled out from our old property. On top of that, all of the purchasing costs added up to $26,790. So I think in total, the property cost us about $123,000 just to get into. We also turned this property into an Airbnb as well, and although it wasn't as successful, it was still paying for itself, so I wasn't too concerned. And we actually live in this property right now, so all up, including all of the furniture and all of the renovation, we did like a little renovation when we first purchased it just to spruik it up a little bit. It's pretty much just broken even. And onto our third property, just before the pandemic hit in the start of 2020, we wanted to go again, so we decided to refinance both of our properties now. The first property we purchased for $415,000 has actually got revalued at $600,000, so I think it was about $185,000 worth of growth in just under 4 years. The second property that we purchased back in August 2019 got revalued at $520,000, so that was a $40,000 increase in under 6 months. Obviously, as I just said, we did do a renovation, but we only spent about 10k on that, so really we've seen about 30k worth of growth. But essentially, I'm including that in the income from my Airbnb. Obviously, we're living in it now, so it's not Airbnb, so I pretty much just factor that renovation in the cost of the Airbnb running costs, and as I said before, it's pretty much just break even now anyway. So when the pandemic first hit, obviously we realized that tourism wasn't going to be as big as it was. A lot of people aren't going to be traveling for work as much as they were. So we didn't want to be too overexposed to the Airbnb or short-term rental stay industry, hence why we moved in here. We moved out of our 12-month lease with my brother and sister-in-law and moved in here just so that we weren't overexposed to that one specific sector. Our first property though is still on Airbnb and is currently being listed out like a normal rental lease. We've got someone in there for 6 months, so they're pretty much just living in there like it was their home. So obviously it's on a much lower rental yield than it was. We're getting a lot less income from it, but I'm happy that it's still paying for itself. Also, my wife is due in like 70 days now, so having to change bed sheets on a regular isn't going to be super ideal. So after moving out and refinancing those two properties, we had about $122,000 saved as a deposit between savings and equity to buy our third property. Speaking to our mortgage broker again, he was able to pre-approve us for another $500,000 on a 10% deposit, so we would be having to pay LMI once again. But essentially all we needed was $50,000 $50,000 as a deposit and purchasing costs on top, which would have been about $30,000. So all up about $80,000 out of pocket, which hones back to my point before about having a safety buffer. So if it was only going to cost us $80,000 to get into a third property, we still had $42,000 worth of a buffer there for a rainy day. We actually diversified for our third property purchase. We purchased it in Sydney and our other two properties are in Melbourne. But that one we purchased for $473,800. And that's a pretty odd number, but essentially we had a killer buyer's agents who negotiated the deal for us. I've always been a massive advocate of using a buyer's agent, especially if you're purchasing in another state. Like if you don't understand the ground and the little networks and the way to get to the train station or the way to get to the park, if you don't know those things and have your boots on the ground, then it's super important to get someone who does. The property is actually rented out for $420 a week, so it is positively geared by about $23 a month. I guess that's another huge thing that I want to emphasize in my portfolio today is I don't really believe in negatively gearing. Like why would you want to spend $1 to only get 30 cents back? All of my properties are positively geared and there's certain strategies like the short-term rental stay that can allow you to get into that positive territory. So if we round that bad boy up, being the third purchase, to $480,000, our first property at $600,000 and our second property at $520,000, all up that's $1.6 million worth of property. Our current outstanding mortgage debt is $1.3 million, which gives us a total portfolio LVR of about 82%. From that first property purchase, we've generated about $225,000 worth of equity. However, the purchasing costs for all three properties sums up to about $67,000. If I had to sell all three properties tomorrow, it would cost me about $72,000 in capital gains tax and agent selling fees. And if we take out about $16,000 of renovations that I've done on both properties, we would have made about $70,000 if we had to sell everything today. However, I'm not planning to sell anytime soon. I'm hoping to never have to sell. All of my properties are a 30+ year play. I might sell them off in my retirement if I need to, but yeah, essentially they're all positively geared, so they're not costing me anything to hold, and I just want to hold on to them for the long term. And banking that property values are going to increase over time. I'm hoping, about 5%. The Australian average has been about 6.7% per annum for the last 30 years, but banking, if they grow by 5% per annum, then the value of my portfolio should be increasing by about $80,000 every single year, compounding. Looking at my portfolio moving forward, we're pretty much maxed out at my borrowing capacity. Obviously, we could buy under different entities or different structures or something funky like that, but I'm pretty happy and content with where my portfolio currently is. I'm planning on doing another video on all of the running and holding costs of my portfolio. So if you guys want to get some insights into all of the expenses, the incomings, the outgoings, and what it costs to actually hold a larger portfolio, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. I want to know where you guys are at with your property portfolio. Leave it down in the comment section below. As always, seek your own professional financial, legal, taxation, and property investing advice for your current situation. These videos are just my opinion and are general in nature and should never be considered as personal advice. Thanks again guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got some insights out of it and how to build a portfolio over a short amount of time. But until next time, happy house hunting.